In your experience of post-conflict, because that's where you said largely, do you see any kind of pattern? Because you're on the outside, so you are in a seat where you can take an aerial view when something comes up. Since you've handled both in the East and the West, is there a commonality or a particular pattern that you see, or there are different ways of looking or viewing?
I think that particularly on mediation, it's interesting that each society has very traditional ways how to deal with conflicts. Also institutionally, in some areas there's, village leaders, religious respective persons. In some areas it's the women, it's the teacher who have an authority to mediate conflicts, or if it's not mediation, then maybe it's closer to arbitration, where the conflict parties are either coming or forced to come, and there's some sort of a settlement. Either it's entirely on a free will, or it might be even forced to some extent through arbitration, through institutions. But I think that every society or every different place has already some traditional ways of dealing with conflicts, and that makes it sometimes easier or more difficult to come with the concept of mediation. In some areas it's very close already to mediation, and then it's just being called differently, and there's maybe no need to call it mediation, but they just have to be reminded on their traditional and good ways to work or to solve conflicts. And in some other areas it might have been more close to arbitration, more related to authorities, to hierarchical decision-making, and then maybe the concept of mediation offers something that is closer to the free will and with less pressure. So in that sense, I think that it's always important when coming as an outsider or even as an insider to see what kind of experiences does the society already have with dealing with conflicts, and to what extent can that be helpful to build on or can be reactivated in terms of conflict resolution. Now, you were saying before East and West as two poles, maybe. I would say it's fairly difficult to make a huge differentiation in there. Very general, the concept of mediation is a very Anglo-Saxon one. Mediation as a terminology and as a methodology, how it's being shaped in the professional community, how it's being shaped in the professional community at the moment, is largely Western influence, I would say. And therefore, it's not, I would say maybe it doesn't fit to all the contexts, because it comes rather from the Harvard negotiation concept. This comes from a cultural context and an approach to conflict, which is, I would say, rather Western influenced. And when you said I'm coming from outside, fairly neutral, that's where I would already have to put a question mark myself. To what extent, when I go somewhere, it's really an accepted methodology, or to what extent it's maybe not a Western concept, and maybe they're more effective, more accepted, different methodologies of dealing with conflicts or transforming conflicts than what I would understand as mediation, the methodology of mediation and per se. What I have experienced working in the former Yugoslavia or former Soviet Union area, except for Russia, I haven't worked in Russia, I have to say, but in other countries that were the former Soviet Union, I have to say that one of the differences is that women are usually playing a much stronger role in conflict resolution compared to the West. But when we look at political representation, they're not having usually key or at least not equal political representation, also not in the East. And so sometimes I would say there is a great hidden potential in the East, that you have a lot of experience and potential and competence of women being mediators and having had experiences with mediation and conflict resolution. But maybe, or not maybe, it's certainly underrepresented in political processes where resolving or dealing with conflicts would be quite good. And I equally have criticism on women underrepresentation in political process in the West. I just think that for me, it was rather a positive, let's say, experience, or a very individual observation, that I personally think that women in the field of mediation and dealing with conflicts in the East are much more, or throughout the past, they were much more involved and having a more prominent role, I would say. And this is a potential that is not being used enough. And this is also where in the narratives, in the competing narratives of the East and West, which are not maybe so valid for everyone, I would say this is definitely a dimension where I would say the East had a great advantage of having a much more prominent role of women in not only political positions, but also in conflict resolution, I would say.